I'll put in a username, give it a password. And I can register, and that takes me to this kind of dashboard page where there's a little bit of secret information which you can see, which you can only get to if you're registered. And I can log out, then log in again. So my username is ABCD, my super secure password, and it gets me back into the application. But there's a few nice little features here which we'll look at kind of as we go to make your user's experience kind of more pleasant. So where I'm going to start is I'm going to start with registration. So registration happens through cd into source, time in there. You can see here's our kind of setup. So we've got an actions directory, components, reducers, we've got a store, various bits and pieces. The registration starts off in components/registration form.js. And in here, basically, we are using Redux form. So you can see that component's connected. And we've got these various different fields which we have to fill in. So very similar to what you were doing yesterday. Form, loads of fields in there. And we've got an onSubmit method which calls out to our we've got an onSubmit event handler which calls out to our onSubmit method. And then in our onSubmit method, we dispatch a couple of actions. We'll take a look at what those actions do in a sec. Just on that field, you'll notice that we've got quite a lot of validators in places. A few of them that you've seen before, but there's a couple of slightly more interesting ones. So these come from my validators.js. Required and non-empty look like what we looked at yesterday. Is trimmed is interesting. This is kind of useful for passwords especially. You'll see that we use is trimmed on the password field and also on the username. Basically, this is making sure that the user hasn't got any white space at the start or end. Lots of users do things like copying and pasting usernames and passwords. And if you save it without chopping off the white space, without telling them, that you're going to chop off the white space, there's like half of your users expect their white space to be saved, half of your users expect it to be trimmed so they don't care whether they paste in some extra spaces. So it's better to just, say that neither of them are allowed to do what they want and say that you just can't submit with a white space at the start. So, for example, if I put space test as my username, it gives me an error there. Similarly, if I put like test space and loads of spaces, that can't happen for my password. So that's one little nice feature. The other thing which is new, there's a couple of these validators, which I guess I would call kind of higher order validators or validator creators. So the idea is that you've got validators which are variable in some way. So you can see, for example, here we create a length validator using our validator creator, which limits it to a minimum of 10 characters and a maximum of 72 characters for our password. So basically, this gives us a way to have a kind of customizable validator. The way that works in code is rather than having, just having a function which takes the value, we have a function with any arguments where we want things to be variable, which returns another function, which is the thing taking the value. So here we give it like a maximum and minimum length that returns a new validator, which is, customized to that maximum and minimum length. Here we do a similar thing with this matches validator. This is basically used to check that the passwords match. So if I put in one password there and I put in a different password there, then it will tell us that the passwords don't match. And you can see that here, basically, we're saying that this varies. So you can get this to match against like any of the different fields in here. In this case, we're specifically saying that this kind of confirm password field should match what's typed in the password field. So, if it doesn't, we get our error message. And again, that's working on a similar system where we pass in the name of the field that we want it to match, and then that returns our validator. A last little thing on those validators, especially with that matches field, you'll notice that we take a second argument here, which is not just the value of that field, but it's the value of all of the fields. And this is basically an object. Redux form gives you this as well. So when one field depends, like whether one field's valid or not depends on a different field or any number of other fields, then you can take this second argument. So what we do here is we check that our value which we've typed in our confirm password field matches the value which we've typed in the password field, and we take that from all values. So a few little things there just to kick us off around the validators and how we're making this nice for our user, give it good error messages, but also a couple of little technical things. I'll pause there. Does that first bit make sense? Do you see how we're validating our user's registration info? Those couple of little technical bits make sense? Yeah, give me a thumbs up if it makes sense. Shout me a question if you got one. Remember that this kind of arrow then arrow syntax, like in ES5, looks something like this. So if we were to write this ES5 style, we would be saying function length takes length as an argument, and that just returns another function value, or function which takes value as an argument. And that has that inner bit. So we're just creating the kind of inner function. This is our validator which takes value. So this is our validator creator. All right, cool. So that's what happens when we fill out that form. Next, let's have a quick look what happens when we submit the form. So we submit the form, we pull out our information and pack that into this user object. And then what we do is we dispatch an action, which is this register user action. And so let's take a look at that. Actions / users, register user. It basically looks like how you'd expect it to. So we make a fetch request to our /users endpoint on the back end. That's a post request. The body of that post request is basically our user. And then what do? We've got a little function which I've pulled out. This is similar to what you were looking at yesterday. It's in actions /utils, which is just responsible for dealing with the errors from the response. Let me check I'm on the right branch. I'm not. That's slightly more complicated than what you're saying. Let me get to my master branch. I've been doing a little bit of work on this. But here's our kind of slightly pulled out version. Basically, it does that error handling the same as you were looking at yesterday. And then we get our information back, we decode it, and you'll notice that if there was an error, an asynchronous error, then we do the same thing as yesterday. So we return a submission error. So we also get any asynchronous errors which come through. The big place where we'll see that is if I try to register another user with the same username. In our server, there's a test for that. So, for example, if I try to re-register my user ABCD, then we'll get our asynchronous error, which tells us our username is already taken. So we have to change that. So that's the first thing we do when we register. The second thing we do is we basically automatically log in. So if I change this to ABCDE and hit register, you'll see that straight away we're taken to the next page. This is kind of a fairly clever little hack that basically we say, okay, what we'll do is when we submit that form, we'll register the user, and assuming that succeeded, so we've got a dot then there basically to tag on and say, yeah, that went well. So we've got it here. If that succeeds, then we dispatch this login action, which is basically the thing which goes away and logs in with our credentials, with our username and password. We'll look at that login action a little bit more in a second and see what's going on inside there. But fundamentally, that's our registration process. We fill out our form, make sure all the validators pass. Then we dispatch our register user action, which registers, and then assuming that succeeded, we dispatch our login action, which takes me fairly nicely to our login form, which we'll see basically the same patterns again. So it's using Redux form again. It's got the validators for the username and password, that they're both required and they can't be empty. And you hit the login button, and what happens, it goes up to the on submit, and it dispatches your login action with whatever was typed in here. So for example, if I type ABCD and then type in my password, you can see that it logged me in. And similarly, if I get my username and password wrong, this is using the submission error. That's my password which I'm using for this. As I said, it's super secure. If I log in with a password which doesn't exist, or with a username that doesn't exist, or an incorrect password, then it gives me a message saying it's unable to log in and I should try again. So the login form, there's kind of nothing particularly extra new there that we haven't looked at already. From there, let's take a quick look at our login action. I'm totally the wrong place now. I've gone the wrong way. So let's have a look at our login action, which is here. So what does our login action do? First up, it dispatches an auth request. So this basically follows this request success error pattern, so we can get a nice little loading indicator telling us we are logging in. If I have a look in my reducer, you can see that on auth request it sets loading and unsets any error. So it dispatches that, and then it makes a fetch request to our login endpoint. So this is basically where we're going to exchange our username and password and, in theory, get a JWT back, which will validate us from now on. So we pass in our username and password. We get back our authorization token in our JSON. And then we call this store auth token. This store auth info function. And this store auth info function is basically what's going to, save our auth token. We'll have a look at how that works in a second. So if it all goes well, we save it. If it all goes wrong, then we dispatch an auth error. Which again over here sets the loading to false, tells us what the error is. And we also return a submission error, which is what's going to give us that unable to log in, please try again. And, goes from there. So that is basically the kind of flow of logging in that we send the username and password, get back some JSON, hopefully, which is our auth token. If it all goes wrong, send back a submission error. Before I get into the weeds of this, is everyone kind of happy with what the kind of high-level flow of authentication looks like? Give me a thumbs up if that makes sense. Shout me a question if you got one. Only a few thumbs there. Has anyone got anything they want me to run back over in that part? Okay, in that case, I'll keep moving. As I say, you will have a lot of opportunity. Jeff, validation. So on our login form, for example, so you'll remember that basically the way it works is that we pass in an array of these validator functions. So for example, here we're passing in this required function and the non-empty function. Those two things are basically things which take whatever we type in the input and they check them, against like a certain set of rules. And if they're all good, then it carries on. If there's a problem, then it'll display the string, which was the error. So if we take a look at our validator functions, basically you can see they're taking that value in. And if those functions return undefined, then basically it says it's all good. And if they return a string, then that's the error message that it will show up. So for login, there's not too much. We just check that they've entered something and they haven't just entered spaces. So if I just enter spaces here, it says it cannot be empty. Registration, the kind of slightly more thing was that we're also checking the length and checking that they match. So for example, on our password, if I only enter something 3 characters long, then it tells me it must be at least 10 characters long. And if I get these two to not match up, then it tells me that they don't match, basically. And that's really all there is to that validation side of things. Does that make sense, Jeff? Cool. And yeah, of course, Sarah. Yeah, I'm jumping back to this in a second. Hey, Anna. Oh, Anya, sorry. Yeah, Sarah, I will talk more through what's going on here in a sec. So let me jump through to the next bit and take a look. Anya, sorry, did you have a question? Oh, okay. All right, cool. So let's get to this and let's take a look at where we do the kind of real key stuff with that reducer. So as I said, in our login form, we dispatch that login action, passing in our username and password. And in the login action, if it all goes well, then what we do is we call this function called store auth info. And we pass in a couple of things there. We pass in our JWT, and we also pass the dispatch function. This is basically just a kind of shortcut to allow store auth info to dispatch its own actions. This is really just us kind of routing some information through so it can be used elsewhere. And we're going to use this store auth info function in a couple of different places. So we're sort of abstracting out, this is something that we'll reuse a couple of times. And this is our process which we'll go through every time we get some authentication info. So let's look at what we do here. First up, we take our JWT and we decode it. We grab all of the information which is stored within there. So fundamentally, in this case, that's just storing information about our user. So things like, what is their username, what's their first name, what's their last name, and so on. And then when we've done that, we dispatch these two separate actions, which are set auth token and auth success. And they do two things. They control different parts of our authentication state. So set auth token basically stores the kind of raw authentication token in this auth token piece. So that stores that we have an authentication token, which we can then use to try and make requests. Auth success, in contrast, stores the information about the user themselves. So it stores this current user object. And basically, this is what we're going to use to say whether someone's logged in or not. So if current user exists, then we'll say, yes, we're logged in because we've clearly managed to, grab some correct data from our server. If that doesn't exist, we'll say we're not logged in yet, so we'll redirect back to the login page. So that's our kind of high-level stuff which we do there. We store our token for use later, and then we store our user information. Did that make sense to everyone? Sarah especially, I know you wanted to take a quick look at that. Yeah, thumbs up if that's all good. Shout me a question if you've got one. Okay, cool. So we've got that information stored. We can probably have a look at it if we log in. So I'll log in as ABCD. And if I have a look at my state now, do this the manual way. You can see in our auth data, we've now got the auth token, which is our JWT, and we've got our current user stored. And basically from there, we're pretty much good to go in our application. Like if we want to make any requests to get data from our endpoints, then we can do it passing in that auth token as our bearer token. If we want to know things about our user, we can look in the current user. Our app builds from here. I'm not doing anything very sophisticated here other than, showing that information and grabbing a little bit of data using the auth token. So we've managed to register and or we've managed to log in. Now I just want to look at a few of the kind of little features which make this process nicer from our user's point of view. The first thing I want to look at is how we redirect. So you'll notice that when I type in ABCD here and then type in my password and log in, then I'm redirected straight away to /dashboard. And, that's taking me to my user dashboard. Now, the way that works is actually relatively straightforward. There are a couple of pages where this happens, which are the registration page component and the login page component, the landing page component, which is sort of that front login page. And both of these just use an if statement to do that switching. You'll remember I basically said that we consider the current user to be the basis of whether we're logged in or not. This is just kind of a wrapper around that registration form. So you'll see when we're here, I have my, if I go right the way through all of my routes of the login form. But anyway, I have my landing page, which then wraps my my login form, or on registration, it would be the registration page, which wraps the registration form. And in those components, basically, I map in that information about whether we're logged in or not. So I say, okay, if the current user, which we've got stored, isn't null, then we consider logged in to be true. And if it is null, then we consider ourselves not to be logged in. So that gets mapped in. And then basically what we say is, okay, if we're on the registration page and we're logged in, so if there's props.logged in, then we'll straight away redirect to /dashboard. We'll redirect to the user dashboard. Otherwise, if we're not logged in, then we'll show the registration form like we should. And because this kind of switches from false to true, then this will re-render when logged in switches from false to true. So by logging in, we basically get automatically redirected by this getting called again, this being true this time, and us being redirected. So that's the kind of simple side of our redirection, that we go from the login page, or we go from the registration page straight to our dashboard if we're already logged in. There's a slightly more difficult bit of this too, which says that we shouldn't be able to see the dashboard when we're not logged in. So you'll see, for example, if I try to go to /dashboard, so I'm not logged in at the moment, then it redirects me straight back to my original page. It redirects me straight back to my login page so I can log in. And this kind of stops people seeing, anything which they shouldn't if they don't have access to it. The way in which we do that is using, and this is something that we've not looked at before, but it's something called a higher order component, and it's in this thing called requires login. Now there's a lot of syntax going on here. Higher order components are kind of interesting. Basically, the idea is that they are a component which wraps another component. And you're already familiar with a few higher order components from the kind of using side rather than writing side. So you have used connect, which is a higher order component. It wraps another component and passes in some extra props. You've used Redux form, which is a higher order component, which wraps a component and adds all of the kind of formy behavior, passes in all of that information. Well, our requires login here is also a higher order component. What it's going to do is it's going to wrap the component that you pass in. I'm not going to go through all of the syntax and kind of way higher order components work in detail here. There's a really good bit of documentation in the React document if you want to take a really close look at this. What I am interested in is you kind of understanding the high level mechanism which happens here. And that high level mechanism all happens in this this requires login component. So basically the key thing here is that you can follow the logic. So what our logic says is it basically says, okay, are we currently authenticating? So this is our loading bit of our state, which we saw that we set with the request and unset with success or error. If we're doing that, then we render a little message. So, this could be a loading spinner or whatever, which just says that we're currently logging in. Otherwise, if we are not logged in, so this is the same test as before, if current user is equal to null in this case, or if there was an error which took place, so for whatever reason we couldn't log in and something's gone wrong, then we redirect back to the landing page, back to where we can log in. Otherwise, if it all goes well, then we render the component which we're wrapping. So if I have a look at the dashboard component, component/dashboard, you'll see that this requires login basically wraps, albeit via a connect, it wraps the dashboard component. And with that dashboard component wrap, if none of these are true, so if we're not authenticating and we are logged in and there was no error, then it's going to render that dashboard component out, and that's what we see when I log in successfully, basically. So if I log in and take a look here, you'll see that via lots of levels, my requires login component, which is this, is wrapping my dashboard component, which is this, which is the thing which I actually see. So, as I say, lots and lots of syntax going on here, and I'm not really concerned with you understanding every last detail of this. What I am interested in you understanding is the way in which this looks to see whether we're currently authenticating or whether we're authenticated, and either redirects us back to the home page if we're not logged in, back to the landing page, or actually renders out the component if we're happy with that. So does that piece make sense? Do you see how we're redirecting around the app based on our login information? Give me a thumbs up if you're that far. Show me a question if you've got one, or want me to run back over anything in there. Pass-through props is an interesting thing. Basically, what that does is it allows you to pass props through this requires login component down to our component that we're rendering. This is sort of a piece of good practice rather than anything. So we're really not using this, I don't think. Let me see where we render our dashboard. So in components, yeah. So here we're just rendering the dashboard component and we're not actually passing any props in. If there were some extra props that we were passing to the dashboard, so let's take out the route part of things, and let's say we were just rendering dashboard, but we wanted extra props here, which was like foo equals bar, as equals whatever. These would be the pass-through props. They're basically the things that we want to go straight through our higher order component. So straight through our requires login, not be touched there at all, and just come straight down to our dashboard component. That said, because we've not got any, we could happily delete everywhere where it says pass-through props in here and it wouldn't make a difference. But there's quite a few bits of kind of good practice around higher order components, which they tell you to do whatever. So this pass-through props is one of them. This whole bit of code here is just to do with making it look correct in the dev tools. That's another bit of good practice. So this looks like requires login connect dashboard is all of that code. And all of that's described in more detail in the higher order component guide if you want to take a look at that maybe. Does that make sense? Cool. Anyone else got any questions at this point? All right, great. So last couple of things I'm going to look at are to do with the idea of basically staying logged in. And so if I'm here and I'm logged in, you'll notice that if I refresh the page, then it logs me in again automatically. It hasn't forgotten my login credentials. It's actually saved them, and it authenticates me and gets me, back to the place I was trying to get to. This requires a little bit of technology called local storage, which is built into the browser. Out of interest, has anyone used local storage before? Give me a thumbs up if you have. Give me a thumbs down if you haven't. Cool. That's plenty enough thumbs down for me to talk about it a bit. So I'll show you the code and then we'll talk about what it does. So you might have noticed in my login action and in this store auth info piece, there's actually one more function which got called, which was this function called save auth token. And that's coming from this local storage file. And this is basically all about storing that auth token actually in the browser. So local storage you can think of as kind of an extra storage place, and it persists across browser refreshes. So what I'm doing is I'm storing the auth token here by saying local storage.set item. And then at a later date, what I can do is I can load that up again. So, I shut down my browser, I come back to it a week later. And when I come back a week later, what I can do is I can grab my old auth token from the browser and start using it again. Grab it from this local storage. Now, local storage obviously has some restrictions placed on it. The most important one is that each website that you visit has a kind of separate local storage area. Because obviously there'd be an issue if it was shared. So if facebook.com stores your auth token in local storage, and then I get you to visit myevilwebsite.com and that can grab the auth token that Facebook's trying to store there, then I've got access to all of your Facebook data. Which you probably don't want. So local storage is kind of per URL, and you can look at it, in fact. So if I go to, I can never remember which tab it is. If I go to the application tab here, then in the storage piece, you can see in local storage, one of the pieces of information I've got here is my auth token, which is the thing I've got saved. You can also see another couple of things from Firebase. That's because I've been developing things on localhost 3000, and that's doing a similar thing to store info in there. So my token gets saved there in the local storage, and that happens the moment I log in. Then let's see what happens. So there's a couple of different mechanisms for doing this, Alexa, but this is one of the ways of doing that. Yeah, exactly. This is that idea. So like websites which have a checkbox to check or uncheck, one of the things which it might be doing is it might be storing in local storage or not storing in local storage. The other way people do this is using cookies. They're really just kind of two different solutions to the same problem, and there's advantages and disadvantages to each of them. We choose the local storage way because it's not vulnerable to one particular type of security attack. That said, it is vulnerable to a different type of security attack. So it's a bit of a trade-off here. But yeah, that's definitely one of the things which it could well be doing when you do this, is storing that information in local storage. So we store our auth token. We don't check a box this time, but we could be checking a box which says, yeah, keep me logged in. And then what happens next? Well, let's say we go away from our site and we exit our browser and we come back 2 days later, or we just refresh our browser straight away and we want to be logged in again. If I have a look in store.js, this is really just a convenient place to put this code, by the way. This could go anywhere. But basically, when we first visit our page again, then it will reload our JavaScript, and this code gets run basically at the very start of our code at the very start of our code. So just after we create the store, then this will happen. So what do? Well, first up, we try to load our auth token from local storage. So it uses that load auth token, and that tries to get that auth token item. So that will fetch this long old JWT string. And then what does it do? It says, okay, if we manage to get it, so if we've saved an auth token before, then what we're going to do is we're going to dispatch our setAuth token method. So that will basically save the auth token in our state. Let's have a look at our reducer. So that's this method, which if you remember, we use when we log into it. Basically stores the token so we can use it at some later date. And then the next thing it does is it calls refresh auth token. And refresh auth token uses the refresh endpoint. If you remember that process where basically we can take an old auth token and swap it for a new one, which has a kind of later expiry date. So if we've found an old auth token here, what we do is we say, okay, let's go and let's refresh that and, get ourselves a new one, which we can then use to carry on working with our application. That refresh auth token action essentially looks pretty much like the login action. It looks very, very similar. The only difference being that this time we pass in our existing token as a bearer token when we go to the refresh endpoint. But everything else looks the same. We try to get a new auth token, and then if we get it, then we go through all of the same steps as we did when we logged in. So we set the new auth token in our state, we decode it and set the user information in our state, and we replace the auth token in local storage with that new one that we've managed to fetch. And obviously that means that we've saved our current user in the state, so it logs us in. It's happening automatically, and then we can carry on using our application. So that's how local storage basically allows us to have this kind of persistent login. And obviously, if you don't log in for too long, then the auth token expires and this refreshing is going to fail. And then you'll just be taken back to the front page. Let's say you didn't log in for like a month and the refresh period was a week, for example. Then you'd just be taken back to the front page and you could log in with your username and password again. So that's how we get this kind of persistence going on, how we can go away from our page and then come back to it and it automatically logs us in again. And you don't have to have it, and it's not really suitable for some applications. But in this case, super useful. And, it gives you that nice behavior where you come back to a website and you don't have to type in your username and password again. Does that bit make sense to everyone? Do you see how we've managed to get that next bit of behavior and get that nice thing for our users? Give me a thumbs up if it makes sense. Shout me a question if you got one. Okay, cool. So the very last thing I'm going to just quickly take a look at is one more feature, and this is designed for people who use your application for a long time. So again, that the tokens have an expiry period. So after a day or 7 days or however long, your token's going to expire, and you're not going to be able to make requests to the back end anymore. And your app will mystically stop working, essentially. If you've just kept that tab open for weeks at a time, you go back to it and you expect it to work. Well, in theory, it might not. So what we need to do to get around that is basically every once in a while, we need to refresh our auth token automatically in the background. So let's say it's got, a 7-day expiry time, or every hour or every, 5 hours or every day or whatever it might be. we could go and we could say, okay, let's grab a new authentication token just so we push back that expiry time a little bit, and let's work with that new token rather than working with the old one. So the way that we implement that is actually within one of our components. It's done in the top level app component. And there's a bit of logic going on here, but it's not too hard to understand, I don't think. So the real key of it is in this start periodic refresh function. And what this does is it uses a little function called set interval. Set interval is like a JavaScript built-in function. And basically what it does is it runs another function every X milliseconds. And so here you can see that when we call start periodic refresh, it calls set interval, which starts this function running like every, however long. So what's the period? Well, it's 1,000 milliseconds in a second times 60 seconds in a minute times 60 minutes in an hour. So once an hour, this function is going to get run. What's the function? Well, basically, it's really straightforward. We dispatch our refresh auth token action, and that takes care of refreshing our token for us. And that's really all there is to this, periodic refresh. The only other little bit that's important here is that we only want to do this when we're logged in. Obviously, if we're trying to do it when we're not logged in, then we don't have a valid auth token. So once an hour, it's going to be doing something pointless, which we know is going to fail. So we deal with that in this component did update. Component did update gets run when basically some new props have got passed in. So what we can say here is we can say, okay, if we previously weren't logged in and we've now become logged in, then we'll start that refresh process. If we were previously logged in and we're now not logged in, then we're going to stop that process. And to stop that process, you just use clear interval. That's kind of the pair with set interval to stop doing something every however long. And that's really all there is to that part. So, this is just for people who keep the app open for longer than your token expiry time, or keep logged in for longer than your token expiry time. What this will do is once every however long, it'll go away and grab a new auth token, keep them logged in over that time. Does that last little bit make sense to everyone? Do you see how we're refreshing and how we're using set interval to do that on a kind of periodic basis? Thumbs up if it makes sense. Shout me a question if you got one. Thomas, that is a good question, and actually that is like the perfect segue into what your actual job for today is. Basically today what you're going to be doing is you're going to be working on a kind of slightly more secure version of this client. So what we've looked at today would work perfectly for something where there's not super sensitive user information involved, something where you want all of those extra niceties for your user. But I'm sure you've all logged into your bank's websites and you'll see that they behave somewhat differently to this. So your banking website will try to log you out after a certain amount of time, as Tom said. It won't automatically log you in when you come back to it. It will probably have shorter lived tokens if it's using tokens for authentication. Basically, all of these things make it a bit more secure. So, if you're doing this on a shared computer and someone comes up behind you and goes back to your bank website, then they can't send themselves all of your cash. So your job is basically going to be adapting the code that we've got. So Thomas, one thing that you are probably going to be looking at is this idea of booting users after a certain amount of time. So you'll be using something similar to this set interval, except this time, after a certain amount of time, rather than refreshing the auth token, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be logging the user out, which I haven't talked about actually. I should probably just quickly mention logout. Logout's super simple. It's so simple that I'm even not going to find the code. Let me trace this through from my component. Let's see, that's probably my header bar. Calls this.logout, which dispatches clear auth. Clear auth token. Oh yeah, that makes sense. I've already got that open somewhere. You can see in our clear auth, basically all logout involves is just forgetting everything we know. It's kind of a simple way around it. So we say, okay, we've forgotten what the auth token is, we've forgotten what the current user is, we'll clear it from the local storage, and that'll be good. So that's going to be one of your jobs for the afternoon, or for today. Also, try and spend just a little bit of time in your pair this morning, like first up, talking through the client and taking a look at how it's working, making sure that you're both like really happy with all of those bits that we've looked at today. Because as I say, I haven't gone through in complete detail. It's been kind of a high-level overview of what's going on. So I think that's pretty much it from me. Has anyone got any questions about what you need to be working on today? All right. Cool. Well, in that case, I will let you jump into your pairs and get on with it. I'll be around on Slack, so create a TA ticket if you want me to come take a look at anything. Otherwise, I'll catch you all after lunch. Thanks, folks.